Joe, you mentioned that as much as 30%, or maybe even more in some departments, of their RT labor is not captured, is not associated with the CPT code. So, what are those RT managers and directors and leaders? What are they to do when they need to provide these value added services, but there's no justification, no CPT code behind them? How do they do that?
Yeah, so if I may preface before I respond, is that I would like to kind of just briefly at a high level kind of walk you through kind of the CPT code connection and how it ends up into the revenue side or productivity side for a respiratory care department. Uh, so you have the approved CPT codes for respiratory services. That CPT code, as I mentioned in the beginning, has a description. So we have to be very careful that we're choosing the right procedure to match that CPT code. The next item is there's always a charge code linked to that, and then linked to the charge code is a time standard, or also called an RVU. RVU is time standard for that. So if in a budget tends to capture the time standard, and that's where in most respiratory care departments or directors, that's what they usually see. Is they'll see the volume they completed yesterday, they'll see the hours used for labor hours, and then they will see the next layer with that is based upon the labor hours used, the volume that was done. If that matches up to their budgeted that was approved for this current year. I want to go back a little bit to the hours part, because I mentioned about it. Part of the labor report will include actual like clock in hours used for staff. It could be eight staff members on a 12-hour shift that equals X amount of hours. So when a budget is created, you look at two main factors: are your productive hours, and then your volume. And I don't want to get too much into the math behind that, but to answer your question, how do you account for the additional hours that you do not earn by a CPT code, charge code, which goes into a time standard? Is that I would suggest, this is what I personally do as a director, is I end up tracking my actually clinical hours that I cannot charge for. And I begin to, maybe over 3 months, maybe over 6 months, begin to add up these hours. And then you would if you're in the middle of a year where your budget's already created, now you have good data to explain what's called an hours variance on a labor report. Then for the next year's budget, you add those hours that are non-chargeable because there's no CPT code for them, and you add them to the productive hours for your new proposed budget. And then you divide that to your actual true volume, and you'll get a productivity factor. So now you can, for next year, you have your budget corrected because you added those hours in that are clinical interventions that you cannot charge for, that were not showing up before. Now we did a run rate and add them to now our new productive hours, and that will give you a new productivity number. So we can continue on with our clinical assignment given to therapists. They can then effectively meet the patient care needs, and then as a director level, the budget that comes out, or maybe yesterday's budget we look at, there should not be a labor variance. So that basically is, if you're in the middle of a current year, you would still track those hours. You can explain that to your respective A team that these are interventions that we have to do, but there's no charge code for them. But I will keep track of these, and then I'm going to add them next year's budget to my productive hours to build the right budget. So many times I'm a firm believer, don't let a billing rule change, or if you can't charge for something, change your clinical practice, because that ultimately, in my mind, affects patient outcome. I always like to build the correct budget for our current workflow or current demands for each department.